All right, so this is a Thomas Sowell video. Anytime I see a Thomas Sowell video pop up on my feed, I try to watch it. He's very insightful. Um, he wrote one of my favorite books of all time, Black Rednecks, White Liberals, and it really explains the South in a way that a lot of people don't understand. And he's a black man from the South. Educated in I think New York, or he moved to New York, and I think he might have gone to hell or hell. He went to hell and got educated. No, he went to either Yale or Harvard, I think. Very educated guy, and really explained the South. And I grew up in the South, and then when I read his book, I was like, that explains my experience. So let's listen to him talk.
The Nazi amalgamation of nation and race under totalitarian rule, one people, one country, one leader, led to the horror most unforgettably burned into the history of Germany and of Germans: the murder of millions of Jews and others deemed to be of inferior races. Was this the culmination of long-standing beliefs and actions of the German people, or a monstrous new creation of the Nazis? In Germany, as in other countries, there were people hostile to the Jews on religious, racial, or other grounds. Nor were these isolated, anti-Jewish individuals. There were institutions, movements, and political parties hostile to Jews, sometimes bitterly and venomously so. And these included historic figures from Martin Luther to Richard Wagner. But the ultimate question is how all this affected the behavior of the German people as a whole, as compared to other peoples in Europe and elsewhere. Self-aggrandizement and bias against others has been too tragically pervasive throughout human history and among peoples around the world to make it a distinctive characteristic of a particular people or a particular era. However, racism in its modern sense of belief in innate genetic inferiority and superiority of particular races has had a shorter history, dating from the last half of the 19th century, when some regarded this doctrine as a logical corollary of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. Hostility to Jews, for example, had existed for thousands of years, but anti-Semitism, in the strict sense of believing in the biological inferiority of Jews as a Semitic people, was one of the offshoots of what was regarded as scientific racism. This new racism that wrapped itself in the mantle of science was neither peculiar to Germany nor limited in its application to Jews. In the United States, some referred to the immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe as the beaten men of beaten races, who would be incapable of being able to be absorbed into American society. The eugenics movement sought to limit the reproduction of inferior individuals and races so as to prevent the lowering of the national intelligence in future generations. Planned Parenthood was founded not simply as an organization for limiting the size of families in general, but more particularly to reduce the reproduction of the black population in the United States, as Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger herself noted. Such ideas were common among intellectuals who considered themselves progressive at the beginning of the 20th century. Ironically, although the logical corollary of this genetic determinism was that national IQs would fall over time, as less successful people with generally lower IQs tended to reproduce at a higher rate than more successful people with higher IQs. Research in the last years of the 20th century showed that scores on IQ tests had in fact risen substantially in more than a dozen nations during the course of a generation or two. The question here, however, is not the validity of genetic determinism, but how widespread and how openly avowed it was during a particular era. Germans were neither exempt from nor unique in their susceptibility to this doctrine. Hitler's racism represented the gutter-level application of an idea discussed in more lofty tones at higher intellectual levels. Racism in our narrow modern sense has been a significant force for a little more than a century, while violent and lethal hatred of other groups goes back thousands of years. There were pogroms against Jews in Europe and similar mass slaughters of Chinese minorities in Southeast Asia, centuries before most people had ever heard of genetics. What, then, has been the record of Germans in this longer and broader history of intergroup hostility, discrimination, and violence? Comparing Germans with other Europeans for the sake of convenience, it seems clear that whatever differences there were historically tended to show the Germans not as intolerant as most Eastern Europeans, for example, toward the Jews. Jews fleeing from Eastern Europe to Germany constituted about 1/5 of the Jewish population in Germany when Hitler came to power. However tragic that was in the light of later events, it was a very reasonable move in light of the differences between Germany and Eastern Europe at that time. Jews were so widely accepted in Germany that nearly half of all Jewish marriages there between 1921 and 1927 were marriages to people who were not Jews. German Jews were noted for being far more assimilated to the larger Western society than were Jews from Eastern Europe, and this was true not only in Germany, but in the United States and as far away as Australia. German-American immigrant communities welcomed German Jewish immigrants as members of their Turnverein, singing groups, and other cultural organizations. 19th century German Jews living in Chile and Czechoslovakia likewise took part in the general cultural life of German communities in those countries. Jewish views of pre-Hitler Germany were very favorable, not only in Germany itself, but overseas. During the First World War, American Jewish publications were so favorably disposed toward Germany that they were investigated and prosecuted for favoring an enemy nation in wartime, leading to the famous clear and present danger doctrine in favor of free speech by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in cases involving Jewish writers, Abrams versus United States and Schenck versus United States. Even some Zionists in Palestine returned to Germany during the First World War to fight for the fatherland. Jews were, of course, not the only targets of racial hostility, nor Germany the only place where such hostility was expressed and acted out. What has been the record of Germans with regard to other racial or ethnic groups in other countries and in other times? We have already noted the cosmopolitan tone that Germans sought to maintain in the face of group identity extremism among Latvians and Czechs, though in both cases the Germans eventually decided that they had to defend themselves as Germans. In the Western Hemisphere, the first anti-slavery meeting in North America was held by Germans in 1688, and Germans in Brazil were likewise opposed to slavery there. A history of the antebellum South referred to a colony of anti-slavery Germans who settled in Texas, as well as Germans in Virginia who were antagonistic to slavery, and Germans in St. Louis who were strongly anti-slavery. When whites in early 19th century North Carolina voted to deny the franchise to free blacks, this disenfranchisement was opposed by voters in almost all of the western counties of the Piedmont region, where the Germans and the Scotch-Irish were concentrated. While Germans were split on many of the complex issues revolving around race and slavery, no prominent German-American leader was pro-slavery, and, when the Civil War came, the large German population in Missouri was credited with keeping that state in the Union, despite many Confederate sympathizers among other Missourians. As for relations with the indigenous population,
I just want to point out there, these immigrants in South North Carolina, Missouri, Texas, all these places. I'm from North Carolina. They opposed these slavery policies or whatever. People don't realize that the majority of people in the South didn't own slaves. Okay, to own a slave, you had to make a lot of money. Not everybody was making that kind of money and had a reason to have slaves. You know? Well, clearly people don't know that. But it's like people out here in Los Angeles think that everybody in the South just has a, history of slave owner or slave owning or whatever. But that was a very, you had it just, oh my God, just think about it for a minute. Like the amount of financial success you have to have, or the vehicle in which you are making money, has to accommodate for taking care of slaves. It's like if everybody in the South had slaves, like what were these people doing for work? You think the local blacksmith had a slave? What for? He had his family. He was teaching his son and his daughter, things, to take on the business, like to take over the business eventually. It's really silly when you hear people say like, yeah, the whole South just wants slavery back. For what? I'm a personal trainer. I don't know what I would want a slave for. It's just funny to hear people think things, say things that they haven't actually thought about. It's like slaves were predominantly for plantation owners. Okay? How many people own plantations? Not a lot. Not a lot. And I'm from that Piedmont mountain area where these German immigrants came that opposed slavery. Jeez.
Population of the Western Hemisphere. Germans were noted for getting along with the Indians better than other Europeans did, though all had clashes with the indigenous peoples at some point or other. Germans in Paraguay likewise treated the indigenous people in a more conciliatory manner than other Europeans had. In Australia, Germans established missions to help the Aborigines. As noted in an earlier essay, in the German colonies in East Africa, slave traders were hanged on the spot when they were caught in the act.
Interesting. I just love listening to him break things down, with like information. Because a lot of people do not. And look, I get it. People, we have busy lives. We don't want to look at issues for more than 2 minutes because we don't have the concentration faculties to do it. We don't have the attention span. We don't have the time. We're working. We're raising kids. We're starting businesses. We're trying to survive. We're out in line getting a stabby because the government's telling you to do it, So I get it. But holding a stereotypical view is only beneficial with very little interaction. Like if I can understand like, someone from Los Angeles having a stereotypical view of Southerners because they don't have to interact with them a lot. Okay, if you have to interact with someone more, the stereotypical understanding of that person no longer helps you in forming a relationship because there's more to it. There's more to the person now that you've gotten to know them. You're like, oh, okay. He's kind of like he's like 50% the stereotype, but then also he does this. He's got a bunch of black friends. Oh my God. So I guess I can't really call him a racist. Well, I can kind of call him a racist. Like deep down, he's a racist because he's from the South and he's got family members who all wanted to have slaves and probably did. And then you get to know that Southerner more, and then you're like, oh, okay, so his whole family, like generationally, has been poor. They haven't really done much. They haven't found financial success through generations. They really, came out here to America from German immigrants, and did their own thing and tried to make a living for their family and never owns like, oh, okay, cool. All right. Well, I guess he's not a racist. Well, but he's probably a racist deep down because he's a white Southerner. He's a white male. So, deep down he's racist. And then you get to know him and you're like, damn, he's got more black friends than me. And I'm from LA and I'm not racist. How can I be more anti-racist? Well, I gotta make more black friends. Well, black people don't like me. For some reason. I don't know why. Why do they like him more? Well, I can't accept that. He's racist. People are funny. But yeah, don't listen to Thomas Sowell if you want your thoughts and beliefs tested. He really does shine a light on a lot of stereotypes that people have in the United States about the South, and just exposes it. And yet, I read his book, and I'm just thinking to myself, why does everybody think the opposite? You know, and a lot of it does have to do with like the lack of attention that people want to give to the subject of the South, and the nuance of being from the South. People just want to dismiss it. You know, there's a highbrow, better than you mentality that I've always gotten from people from LA. I've always gotten it from people from New York. You know, in those Yankee states, it's just true. Until they get to know me. You know, until they get to know me, and then we like. It's all the time. You have to dispel people's stereotypes. You know, they're like, don't be a bigot and judge someone based on a stereotype, and all they do is judge Southerners and conservatives with a stereotype. But you know, they live in the bigger cities. You know, there's some type of a thing that like people adopt when they live in like New York or LA that I've witnessed, where it's like, well, you know, we live in the mecca of civilization in the United States. You know, we're at the pinnacle of civilizational evolution. You know, you're from a small town, you don't really get it. And it's like, actually, I'm blessed. I'm so blessed that I live in a small town. And you know what? Like, or I come from a small town, grew up in a small town, because I actually have perspective of the opposite. A lot of people in LA don't. A lot of people in LA do not have a perspective of the opposite. And then I know a lot of people now in LA who moved to smaller towns in the South, smaller cities in the South, and they're like, "Oh my God, if I would have known that this existed, I would have moved there years ago." And you're like, "Wow." And everybody, and no one I've met out here in Los Angeles who has moved, who's grown up in LA, lived in LA, and moved to a southern state has ever said, I hate it. Everybody's mean. Everybody's racist. I've never heard that. They love it. They're like, yeah, you know, the stereotype about the South is blah, blah, blah. And I don't get that. Blah, blah. It's funny to me when someone says things like that to me and they're like, wow, I was wrong. I can't believe I was wrong. And you're like, interesting. The culture of LA and the conversations amongst people from LA is so matter of fact when it comes to what the South is, what southern states are, what people from the South is or are, that when you experience it for yourself and you see that it's not true, that you are dumbfounded at the fact that you were wrong. Well, my friend, I think that is called arrogance. I don't know, but it's good. It's good. I'm glad people can see can see better with a new perspective. That's a sign of someone willing to change, willing to accept that they're wrong. Someone humble enough to humble enough to see that they're wrong. That's always good. All right. That's it for this one.